WBC belt that has included Ali, the greatest of all time. They are set and ready to answer who's the greatest of right now. Wilder, Fury 2, here we go.
Okay, we'll start with this Perving magazine. No, Arum isn't embracing what sources say as the estimate for Spence versus Garcia pay-per-view buys.
I heard the satellite and dish numbers were minuscule. Cable really underperformed, way lower than they thought it would do. They were hoping to do 300,000 buys.
In actuality, Arum heard by word of mouth from his sources, cultivated from 6 decades in the game, that maybe 125,000 buys were activated. And in a Thursday follow-up, Arum's perception hadn't shifted, he told me.
We know approximately they'll be lucky to get 120,000. We've just gotten to the point where the numbers being used are not realistic. They don't reflect reality. Remember, this is the Trump era. People are willing to say anything, and people will believe it. But to be so off is crazy.
He said of Kopinger's numeral,
The Athletic has the Donald Trump of sports reporters.
I'll start off by saying that I'm not even sure I can qualify. I'm not even sure that I can believe Mike Kopinger when he says that the pay-per-view did in excess of 250,000 buys. I'm not sure I can buy into that story, though even if I did, 250,000 buys is hardly the benchmark of a superstar, of a celebrity, that even if it did as good as Mike Kopinger says it did, that still ain't nothing to write home about. Now, maybe Mike Kopinger is fudging the numbers himself, or maybe he's just being fed bad intel. This being the misinformation era, neither one of those two scenarios would surprise me. I mean, YouTube's a perfect example. Mike Kopinger takes to Twitter and reports that Spence versus Garcia did about 250,000 pay-per-view buys, and what do the usual suspects do? They take to their little YouTube channels and start talking about how the pay-per-view did 300,000 buys. They've essentially added another 50,000 buys to the pay-per-view's buy rate, even though nobody's reporting that. This is the misinformation era. That's a prime example.
Yeah, I'd say so.
Now, Bob Arum, via his own sources he has amassed, having been in this sport for 6 decades. It's conceivable that after 6 decades, you're going to make certain network connections. You're going to make certain friends that are going to give you certain intel that describes the landscape in the sport more accurately than a YouTube channel would. Better still, Bob Arum, via his own sources, says that Mike Kopinger's numbers are way off, that the actual number for the pay-per-view is closer to 120,000. I'll tell you that common sense in this day and age really isn't all that common. I'll tell you that after 6 decades in the sport of boxing, I feel so inclined to at least consider Bob Arum's proposition, because if anybody would know, he would know. He's been entrenched in this business before many of these YouTubers were a twinkle in their daddy's eyes. And a bit of common sense, depending on what's being said, goes a long way. You know when Bob talks up Pulev, says he's going to knock out Anthony Joshua, you know that that's just Bob backing his guy, backing his man, laying it on thick.
Promoting.
I mean, that's essentially what that is, and I understand that. But when he's talking about these pay-per-view buys,
You know.
it gives you something to consider.
He knows this business.
He knows this fucking industry. Did you guys notice that Teofimo Lopez versus Vasyl Lomachenko wasn't even billed as a pay-per-view? Bob Arum's been talking about this for a long time. The instability of today's pay-per-view market. that the cable and satellite companies charge way too much, the price point is way too high, the average American doesn't want to pay that.
Especially not during a pandemic.
And that was a high-caliber fight, a high-quality fight involving high-quality fighters. But they took a look at the landscape and decided that's just not the way to go, not in this environment. And really, it's a common sense argument.
It is.
That's the problem. A lot of people these days are lacking common sense, because common sense really isn't all that common. A cliche, I know, but true nonetheless. Think about what's going on here in the American market. Now, you don't see Top Rank shelling out pay-per-view after pay-per-view after pay-per-view multiple times a year. You don't see them doing that. Canelo Alvarez, what was and in many ways still is the biggest pay-per-view draw,
Biggest pay-per-view attraction.
in the sport of boxing here today. Not to be confused with Floyd Mayweather Jr., who may or may not make a pay-per-view appearance, but those are limited to novelty acts and freak show fights, not actual fights involving high-level boxers. I mean, as far as that, he's retired. Canelo Alvarez is in many ways the face of boxing in this part of the world. And you don't see Canelo Alvarez relying on the pay-per-view market to finance his paydays. I mean, you don't see that. Essentially, the biggest pay-per-view draw in this part of the world walked away from the pay-per-view market.
Now, why do you think he did that?
I mean, even now that he is a network and promotional free agent, his very next fight, his very next payday, still isn't being financed by conventional pay-per-views, by the conventional pay-per-view model. What does that tell you? What do you think that means?
The signs are all there.
You've got guys like Mike Kopinger celebrating mediocre numbers, like 250,000 pay-per-view buys in a country this size, and it creates this illusion of fertility in today's boxing landscape.
Oh, it's fertile?
Creates this illusion as if business is booming when boxing here today is actually in dire straits than I've ever seen it.
In America.
So when a guy like Bob Arum, who's got 6 decades of experience in this business, says that those numbers are being exaggerated, based on these aforementioned factors, I feel so inclined to believe him. Because if business really were booming, we'd see Top Rank shelling out pay-per-views just as frequently as we see the PBC doing it. Let me tell you something. What was a more highly anticipated fight? Charlo versus Rosario or Lopez versus Lomachenko? You tell me. But only one of those fights was billed as a pay-per-view. There really was more excitement, more enthusiasm expressed at the Lopez versus Lomachenko fight as opposed to the Charlo versus Rosario fight. But Lopez versus Lomachenko wasn't billed as a pay-per-view. Charlo versus Rosario was. We talked about why in my previous video that you got fights that really don't belong on pay-per-view being billed as pay-per-views due to greedy outfits in the sport of boxing. Look to bilk the average boxing fan every time 2 halfway decent guys throw a punch. Every time 2 halfway decent guys throw a punch, it should cost you $80 to watch. You serious? That's not going to help grow the sport. That's not going to bring stability to it. That's going to drive people away from it.
That's why boxing's audience in America is shrinking.
Better still, you got these guys out there telling themselves and each other lies. Pretty low lies, sweet low lies. That somehow Errol Spence Jr. doing 250,000 pay-per-view buys or a little over that is some kind of a big deal, when all that indicates is that his numbers have since dropped. That from the time he debuted on pay-per-view with Mikey Garcia and brought in 360,000 pay-per-view buys, now what he's bringing in is just a little over 250,000. So how is he a star when his numbers are nosediving? You tell me.
He's not a star.
This has got to be the misinformation era, when you got more guys taking cues from a failed actor on YouTube as opposed to a promoter in the sport of boxing with 6 decades of experience. I'll tell you, I don't believe it just because Bob said it.
Not just.
I believe it because I don't see Bob staging all that many pay-per-views. I believe it because I see Canelo Alvarez, a guy who's good for bringing in a certain number of pay-per-view buys. I believe it because, well, he's not on pay-per-view anymore. He decided to go another route. And I believe it because no matter how much guys like Mike Kopinger choose to try to talk up these pay-per-views and look on the bright side, the reality of it is, it's a downward trend. 360,000 to 250,000 is a downward trend, no matter how you spin it. And this is what passes for a pay-per-view star these days? This is what passes for a pay-per-view attraction? That's not at all encouraging.
No matter how many YouTubers want to fudge his numbers.
So I'll tell you what, doesn't actually matter if it's the way that Bob says it is, or if it's the way that Mike says it is, because the truth is, in any event, in any scenario, no matter which set of numbers you choose to use, what it indicates, same fucking thing. Errol Spence Jr. is not a pay-per-view attraction. He's not a pay-per-view star. Because 250,000 pay-per-view buys in a country this size has never been the benchmark for celebrity.
His numbers aren't going up, they're going down.
I mean, can you guys add? Can you guys subtract? If Errol Spence Jr.'s pay-per-view debut brought in 360,000 pay-per-view buys, 250,000 pay-per-view buys is substantially less. About 110 to be exact. 110,000 less pay-per-view buys to be exact. His numbers aren't up, they're down. So, how is he a star? And just in keeping with the theme of things that Bob Arum says, Bob says,
We're already making plans for other opponents for Fury. Pulev will knock out Joshua.
Lay off the wacky tobacco.
I look for Pulev to not only beat Anthony Joshua, but knock him out. Pulev is a big, rugged Bulgarian. I really feel that Joshua is vulnerable, and that Pulev will not only beat him, but knock him out. I will greet this victory with the joy that comes to me. On the other hand, it will disappoint one of my other guys, WBC heavyweight champion Tyson Fury. I talked to Tyson Wednesday. In fact, we're already making plans for other opponents. Fury agrees with me. There is a great chance that Pulev is going to upset the apple cart and beat Joshua.
you know what? If there is a great chance, the way that Arum says there's a great chance, I guess nobody told the bookies, because, you know, Kubrat Pulev is a pretty big underdog in this fight. And, you know, this is where that common sense I was talking about earlier comes into it. This is where common sense is pivotal, you know, because I don't think that Bob Arum actually has any illusions about Pulev's chances here. What I think he's doing is approaching the situation with a sense of humor. Which goes back to what I told you about common sense. I think Bob's got it. I think Bob's got a lot of common sense. He saw the Bogdan Dinu fight. He saw the Rydell Booker fight. And I don't think he honestly believes in his heart of hearts that Pulev is going to win later on today. I think he's just talking up his guy because, well, that's his job as a promoter. And he's hamming it up because, you know, what else can you do but approach the situation with a sense of humor?
The hell are you expecting the guy to say?
Kubrat Pulev doesn't stand a snowball's chance in hell against Anthony Joshua.
I mean, you know he can't actually run around talking like that. You know, he's Kubrat Pulev's promoter. He's got a fiduciary duty to that guy. And even if he doesn't actually believe he stands a chance, the least he can do is urge his man on and give him that vote of confidence. Even if it, you know, seems comical to either me or you. The fight is just a couple of hours away. We're just a couple of hours away from the ring walks. And I'm standing on my square with this prediction. I'm convinced that Anthony Joshua is going to knock Kubrat Pulev out. And Pulev, you know, he probably doesn't see the 6th round. I don't think there's any truth to Bob Arum saying what he's saying. I don't even think Bob himself believes it. But what I did find revealing about this set of comments from Bob is that both him and Fury have already started looking for alternative options for Tyson, you know, in the event that Anthony Joshua loses. I actually happen to think that there's some truth to that. That Tyson Fury, you know what, in all likelihood, in his next fight, he don't fight Anthony Joshua. I told you guys before that if the fight is set to go down at some point next year, likely after February, right? You know, because Anthony Joshua is going to be in action towards the end of this year, you know, could be a couple of months before he returns to the ring. That being said, February of 2021 will make a full year since Tyson Fury's last fight. And I hardly think that Tyson Fury would go into an Anthony Joshua fight off of 12 months of inactivity. That coupled with Bob Arum's comments, you know, that they've already started looking at other guys.
I believe that part.
I believe that bit of it. I believe that maybe they're trying to reschedule the Agit Kambayel fight, or maybe, I don't know, the door's still open for a third Wilder fight. As much as I'd like to think that Joshua and Fury could face each other early next year, it's just too good to be true. It is.
I don't get the impression the fight's going to happen that fast.
I'd love to be wrong about this, but, you know, 12 months of inactivity, the stuff that Bob is saying, Tyson Fury being quite characteristically a wishy-washy guy, yeah, I'm not seeing that fight happening next. In super middleweight news, I'm sure most of you have heard by now that the WBC has so decided to put the actual green belt, the actual world title at 168 pounds on the line in the upcoming Canelo Alvarez versus Canelo-Smith fight. A very curious development, as the winner will have to face their mandatory challenger in Avni Yildirim. Not exactly a high-profile guy, and this is something that we've actually touched on here on the channel several times in the last couple of months, that Canelo-Smith, he's the WBC's Diamond Champion. That Diamond belt can be used as a segue to challenge for the full version of the title, that's going to be on the line here. And we know that the WBC is pretty sweet on Canelo Alvarez. When he tells them to jump, they say, how high? I think this was a missed opportunity for one Caleb Plant, who just so happens to be on the same side of the street as Avni Yildirim. Avni Yildirim, who has a title shot. Avni Yildirim, who was rudimentary in making this development possible. It was only through his cooperation that the belt ended up on the line in Canelo versus Smith. I call this a missed opportunity for Caleb because he's on the same side of the street as Avni, and if the wheels would have been in motion a little faster to make a Caleb Plant versus Avni Yildirim fight, what they could have then done was petition the WBC to allow the green belt, the vacant green belt that was left vacant after David Benavidez blew the weight. Had they petitioned for that as an opportunity to fight for the title itself would have stayed on the PBC side of things. As it stands, it's looking like it's going to go with Canelo Alvarez, as in all likelihood he's going to beat Callum.
Yeah.
I don't think it's off base to say that. I don't think I'm being far-fetched at all. I think the only question here is, should Canelo Alvarez beat Canelo-Smith and become the full-fledged WBC world champion in the super middleweight division? Is he going to honor his obligations as the newly crowned champion? Will he go into an Avni Yildirim fight? Does that seem like an adequate use of Canelo Alvarez's time? Is that the kind of thing he normally does? Is that the kind of guy he normally fights?
Where does that fight take place?
They try to stage that as a Fox pay-per-view, because Avni's a PBC fighter, or could they convince Avni to come over to the DAZN side of things for a one-off? Who's going to pay Canelo Alvarez $20 million or upwards of $20 million to fight Avni Yildirim in defense of that title, as that would be a mandated title defense? There are legitimate questions here, should Canelo Alvarez win this fight, that really do need answers.
Will he vacate the title after he wins it?
Would be rather redundant, it being that they went as far as pursuing the title, having the title on the line in this fight, only to subsequently relinquish it as soon as a mandate comes down. I'm really not sure what's going to happen here should Canelo Alvarez win this fight. If Callum wins it, in all likelihood, he would defend it against Avni, but Canelo, he's a high-profile guy, and Avni, he's not. I really don't know what's going to happen with that.
It's a curious development.